Welcome back to Philosophy from the Frontline. Can you believe it's 2023 and we are starting our third year of doing this? So, catching up with Dave today, but we're going to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart and something that we've always seen and talked about, but a lot of people could be a controversial topic just because some people get their feathers in a ruff when somebody tries to say, well, you're not a combat veteran, but I served, That's always something that's going to be, I won't say contentious, but it's always going to be a point of discussion amongst the veteran community. First and foremost is, bottom line we all know is, your discussion with other veterans is literally just that, discussion with other veterans. So really, it's how cool is your shadow box? And, if you're willing to share the stories of your service with other people, because again, like all too often we have folks that embellish their service, which is frustrating. And then you have a lot of people that have served honorably with distinction, and you'll never even know. You could be walking right past them in the grocery store, and that guy could be a Silver Star recipient, And that's how crazy, particularly the last 20 years have been as far as military service. But as, I was getting started, or as Dave was getting started in the military, and we kind of covered a couple generations in the military, but very, very interesting to always entertain and take a look at, those generations of military service and kind of what the effect was and how things went. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to hit the big stuff, of course, and then we're going to hit some of the smaller incursions and things that have happened. But the one major point that I would like to make, and Dave and I talked about it offline, is if you ever notice, many of the shorter, or I like to call them near misses, are operations that went very, very quickly. And the reason why they were so very quick was because there was a particular military outcome that was trying to be solved. And because of that specific military outcome, the length of the engagement was significantly shorter by comparison to some of the other ones. And we'll get into that as well. But the first one, of course, we'll start off with is, we're going to not talk about the Civil War and the Spanish and American War and the French and Indian War, and we could do a whole other show on that one. But when you think about contemporary military service, kind of the first one that kind of jumps out, at least to me, is World War II or World War I. I don't know how many World War I survivors there are. I'm not sure that there are very many left, if any. But that was a group of group of dudes that like trench warfare. Good Lord, like. All you have to do is watch the movie, was it 1913, to get an insight on how bonkers that war was. Yeah, you know what I mean? You got artillery barrages.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Man, you can see a similar footage on the Eastern Front, the war between Russia and Germany.
Yeah.
During the same time frame, I might add. You guys out there frozen in their own mud, their own piss, can't get out of the hole. I can't imagine having to serve in a tougher environment because you're so restricted.
Yeah.
In what you can do,
And that's
miserable.
And
miserable.
That's literally.
And then you look at the preparation that all these people got received going into that conflict. Here's a pair of boots, here's a rifle, and here's 5 bullets. Best of luck.
And that was one of the things that, like, early on, particularly in World War I, it was just because, like, we didn't have what we know now as the military-industrial complex, so that kind of didn't start spinning up until World War II, and that was kind of the big whole, hey, look, the country is now involved in this, and so there's no way that we can avoid not having every, able-bodied person that's either wearing a uniform, or if they're not in uniform, they're serving at home in the capacity of either working in a hospital, working in some kind of munitions factory, working in a automotive factory building engines or airplanes or whatever. And so you look at the difference between World War I and World War II is the scale in which countries ramped up really to fight those wars. And those are like insanity to me. Like World War I, don't know how guys could have done trench warfare and artillery. And one of the things that came out of it, you heard this both in World War I and World War II. It's just something that we contemporarily deal with now. is shell shock. Well, shell shock is post-traumatic stress, and I would go as far as to say that there was probably a handful of those veterans that came back both from World War I and World War II that probably suffered and died from CTE, and we just hadn't as a society figured out a way to diagnose it yet. So I think that's another consideration that we have to look at in those generations, particularly in World War I and World War II, just because of the amount and the frequency of artillery barrages and how war was just fought at the time, just generally.
I think we're only now starting to see that being replicated in film. And it's not just our people, too. It's, like the English. Was it Peaky Blinders?
Yeah.
Guys that's in shell shock. We were starting to see that in other movies here of U.S. soldiers. It's just now a thing. But back then, information isn't what it is today. And I think as we progress from what you're talking about, the modern battlefield has progressed tremendously. I think it's about as represented as well as compound interest is,
Yeah, that's probably true. And so, wow, I just looked up the numbers, and there are no longer any World War I veterans still alive. They said the last 8 who lived passed away right around 2009. So that's a generation of it's a generation of warriors that we will never see.
Gone.
Yeah. And so hopefully, we've done as best as we could, kind of capturing the information and providing it back. And I think one of the things, if you haven't watched it, and we'll move into World War II, but one of the things, if you have not watched it, is a great way to kind of capture or experience World War II. They did it was on History Channel several years ago, but I'm sure it's still available for streaming now, and that's World War II in color. If you have not watched that, like, they basically took a bunch of the old World War I, like, B-roll from combat camera crews and different various sources and colorized it. So it's a great kind of peek into the environment of what those guys were exposed to, and you get to see it in color. Doesn't make it any less brutal, but at least you get to, it gives you a little bit better perspective when you can see people's faces. And, like, when you look at World War II, the amount of activity that was there was ridiculous. You had the Pacific Theater, you had open water, you had air battles, you had, flying bombing raids, you name it, it kind of happened. And that was really because the whole world was at war. It was not by any stretch of the imagination, by any stretch of the imagination was it something that was not internationally known or taken over completely. Like, there were so many people fighting that there's no way that you could get away from it.
Yeah, I think Pearl Harbor was our real life, the day the earth stood still. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now it's coming here. Can you imagine? I mean, people used to get their news from movie theaters.
Yeah. So how long did it take?
Imagine that. You didn't hear about it or read about it in the paper, We might have, but the way we consume information now is so vastly different. They didn't have the TV.
For real. Given today's environment, there would probably be somebody on the beach in Hawaii streaming zeros on, like, TikTok or Facebook or Instagram or something as these aircraft are coming in, and then all of a sudden, holy crap, like, they just attacked, something, which is insane. But, like, again, like, flow of information is one of those things that's very, very important, and it was delayed. At the most part. And the other part of it is like, think about the amount of censorship. Like, if you go back and you watch some of the old World War II shows or movies or whatever, like, these guys are taking a hard look at every letter that's getting shipped back to make sure that no tactical information is being passed, and they literally had to look at every single document that was leaving the theater. God forbid, like, we ever get to that point where we have to have a whole of government approach like that again. Like, I don't ever want to see it. Is it a possibility? Potentially. But, one of the things that we have to consider is like, World War II, like, ramped up the entire country, and I think there's goodness that came out of it. There's bad things that came out of it. But at the end of the day, man, the World War II generation, think of it this way. These were the guys that were told, hey, we're going over there and we'll come back when the mission's done. And that is a completely different category of human than we have today. Like, could you imagine taking a soldier on his first enlistment and like, hey, bud, you're going overseas and you're staying until the mission's done? Like,
that is, that's indefinite. I mean,
yeah,
that's like seeing all the new recruits and Starship Troopers taking their oath of office. My oath of 3 years or more, or is required by the Federation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, the common thread again, Starship Troopers was those were conscript army, right? So it wasn't just a bunch of volunteers. Like, yeah, they had a handful of them, and those handful of volunteers were volunteering to have opportunity, as a result of their service. And like, again, that's a completely other show that we could get into as well, is talking about how, service should change your citizenship as a veteran of any of these experiences. Like, you should cherish your value things more, I guess. I would think, after serving. But one of the things that you can do, like, if you haven't, and we'll drop it in the description as well, but if you know a surviving World War II veteran and they have not gone on honor flight, do your best to get them on that. So what honor flight does is they fly all across the country. I think there's a couple major cities. I'll have to put the information in the chat. But basically what they do is you put your veteran's name in, fill everything out. Your veteran and an escort get to fly to the World War II Memorial in D.C. And now that things are opening back up, I think they're ramping the honor flights back up, and it's just a great opportunity for that generation of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and all that other stuff to kind of go explore and visit, Washington, D.C., because some people have never gotten to see the capital of the country, which is just insane to me. But when you think about it, like, if I grew up in a farm in Montana and got drafted and went to war, like, my main concern was getting back to my farm after it was all said and done and taking care of business. And like, that was the greatest part of the World War II generation, in my opinion, is that they did the job and then they came back and they continued to work hard, even though they were gone for 4 years and came back. And, our society was vastly different after World War II as well. I mean, I can't put into words, the difference of experience that I've seen people have, as far as discussion and the folks that I've met that have served in World War II, and their perspective and our society's perspective is being completely different.
Well, I think the greater driving forces behind that is there were clear objectives too.
Yeah.
While I might sit there and throw out, an analogy griping about length or terms of service, but in the end, the objective was very, very clear. And what was most important about it was everybody was behind it. The entire country was behind that push.
Right.
I mean, remember, dudes were killing themselves because they couldn't join.
Yeah, like,
that's not an opinion.
Yeah,
I mean,
and fast forward,
that shit happened.
Yeah, and fast forward to today, it's the very opposite, right? It's the exact opposite.
And it's the opposite, but in the end, there were clear objectives. Yeah. Hitler had to be stopped. The German people had to be stopped.
Correct.
That was the Italians had to be stopped.
Yeah, it was an existential crisis.
It was just one of those things where, look, man, don't quit what you're doing until we achieve that. No matter whatever happens between the staging area and the finish line, we must get to the finish line.
Correct.
The difference between what's gone on back then and what's going on today is we're entering into warfare without a clear objective.
Yeah.
And we haven't had it for years. So wars aren't being started to resolve a conflict, but they're being started with, to be maintained.
Yeah.
Right. Is a look back at everything, and you have a great list. And I, what you also put is terms of near misses, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, Operation Eagle, Claw's outstanding example, Operation Urgent Fury, Just Cause, the greatest ass-sitting contest that ever took place, Desert Storm. But in the end, I got to tell you, when you look at that list and you and I, we can talk about it, and we will talk about it for the rest of our lives. Yeah. The heroes that it took, the men braver than me, that fought. But the one that stands out to me the most it always has been, and people look at me like I'm nuts when I say it, is the Cold War.
Yep.
From March, 1947 to 1991. And the reason I say that is the most compelling by far is, man, nobody fired a bullet.
Yeah.
We won. They couldn't take it no more.
Yeah. But as an aside to the Cold War, one of the things that we had happen is what we're actually starting to see again today in the world is people fighting wars through proxy, right? So if you look at the Korean War and the Vietnam conflict, those were kind of like, although they were Cold War time frame, those were proxy wars of the worst kind when you really look at it. Korea, again, and technically that one still isn't over. Like if you're a soldier and you go over there and you do a tour of Korea, guess what? You come back with the Korean War medal. Like, why? Because the window has not closed.
They're still at war, man.
Correct.
And out of all those conflicts, the Korean War, I mean, we literally went to war for another group of people for no other reason than to help that group of people.
Yeah.
And that was the Koreans, the South Koreans.
Yeah.
Vietnam, I mean, maybe the French pulled us into that conflict.
Correct.
I would say. But otherwise, I mean,
yes and no. But again, I think it was all in the interest of stopping, communist growth, right?
Well, and say that too.
Well, Korea more so than Vietnam. You know what I mean? Because I think, and again, I didn't serve in either one of them. Hell, I was barely a 6-month-old when the Vietnam conflict ended. But when you look at those two conflicts, man, like. A lot of people cut their teeth, and as an aside, one of the things we can talk about, Lieutenant General Grange just passed away a couple months ago, and he was like the last multiple CIB winner, so he did World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, get out of here. Like that doesn't even seem real at this point, you know what I mean? Because that would be considered ancient history to a 19-year-old kid that's in high school or college right now. You know what I mean? Like that just doesn't even resonate for guys like us, because we grew up in an environment of honoring heroes like that. It's a scary thought to know again that we're starting to lose that generation. And like World War II has about 225,000, closer to 227,000 remaining survivors from World War II. And most of those folks are probably people that entered service very, very young, so they entered at 17, and they're now in their 70s or 80s or 90s right now. But again, another tough generation. But when you look at the Korean War and Vietnam, like the biggest thing I think actually became the technology jumps that happened in the interwar period between the end of Korea and the start of Vietnam, like the use of helicopters and the use of airframes. Like when you start talking about, bombing people, we got a lot smarter with fighter bombers. Like we had fighters and bombers in World War II. In the Korean War, we had fighters and bombers, and then Vietnam, it was like, hey, look, we've got to have fighter bombers. You had the multi-role aircraft, and again, I'm not an Air Force historian, so do not shoot me, but perfect example is like the change to the F-4 Phantom. The F-4 Phantom used to just be a missile boat, right? And then at some point they were like, hey, we've got to be able to arm this thing so it could defend itself in the air. And they put the cannon on it. And so those are some of the changes that happened. But I think the largest change that happened, writ large in the military was like, hey, we're going to start taking these helicopters and dropping people on a postage stamp and say, go out there and stab these dudes. Go out here and fight this fight. You know what I mean? If you're a young person and you don't have time to read the book, then definitely check out the movie We Were Soldiers Once and Young. And I will tell you that is a brutal representation of just some of the incursions that happened. There's a song called The 8th of November.
If it was not for air mobility, they'd have died to the last man.
Oh yeah, for sure.
There's no way that they would have survived the Adrang Valley.
Yeah, and you had guys out there, and I don't know if you've ever heard of Mr. Novosel, but Chief Novosel, this dude, brilliant guy. So he did a full career in the Air Force, and so Chief Novosel did a full career as an Air Force officer, and the war kicks off in Vietnam, and he's like, hey, like, I want to join back in, and these guys are like, nah, man, we're not letting you back in. You're too old. Your eyes are bad, whatever. You can't pull G-forces in the new aircraft. Like, you're just, you're too old. And so what does Chief do? Or Lieutenant Colonel, retired at that point, walks around the corner, goes and talks to the Army recruiter and was like, hey, man, is there anything that I can do to support the war? And they were like, I see you have aviation in your background. Have you ever flown a helicopter? He's like, no, but I'll learn how. And this guy learned how to fly helicopters. And he and his son were both medevac pilots during Vietnam, which tremendous story. So like, if not doing it justice by any stretch of the imagination, we'll put more information in the podcast description so you can look it up. But like, Mr. Novosel, super stud. Like, he's such a stud that when they started talking about renaming bases, whether you agree or disagree, that's a completely other topic. But as they started to look to rename bases, they actually picked Mr. Novosel to be one of the new bases that they're going to rename, which, if you're going to do it, at least you do it with like a no shit legit hero. Like, that guy's a stud, so if you don't know his background, look him up. Once you read it, you'll understand why they were like, oh, hey, yeah, we could use this guy because he represents, the core values of the military that we want to demonstrate. And and it's frustrating to me because a lot of this stuff, the difference between the long conflicts that we had militarily and the short conflicts that we had, to go back to your previous point that you mentioned, was the political outcome, right? And when things become political, that's when it goes sideways. And so, like, hey, if you're listening to this and you're still in the uniform, you may need to decide when you're going to get out, because there's going to become a certain level. And it's probably now, when we were in, it was probably as you crept into, the command sergeant major billets and, lieutenant colonel, maybe colonel, probably early in our careers, when like, that's when things got a little bit political. But now I'm sure that level is pushed down just like everything else, where it's political probably at, senior captain, junior major level, which is obnoxious and insane. Because as a military member, the least of your concern should be what's coming down from higher that's politically motivated. Like, you got a job to do. Don't worry about all the other BS. But, I just think that's something that I see and that I've observed recently that I'm not a big fan of. And then, of course, more contemporarily, for everybody else, and probably the vast majority of the audience that's listening to this, is global war and terrorism, which started on or about September 11th of 2001 and went until 30 August. And officially, it still hasn't closed because we still have operations that are ongoing, like Spartan Shield and Inherent Resolve. So both of those are still kind of running right now. But like active ground combat, like soldiers deploying regularly on the ground, hooking and jabbing, doing what we did for 20 years, like that is, I won't say officially dried up, but it's dried up significantly by comparison to where it was between like 2003 and 2018. And even still, during the global war and terrorism, like there's so many sub-conflicts underneath there, if you want to call it that like it's ridiculous. So like, you had the guys that went out early. So of course you've got horse soldiers, or was it 13 strong, I think it was, or 12 strong. And then, you had the guys that were basically trying to reopen the landlines that were available to the CIA and special operations during the Russian campaign in the 80s, like trying to reopen those lines of effort. And then, still trying to figure out, why are we going into, Iraq as well as Iran. And I could tell you there's some strategery in there. And if you look at a map around Iraq and Iran, there's a reason why we went to Afghanistan too. And guess what? You're strategically bracketing Iran. And oh, by the way, check it out, dude. I have, 500,000 soldiers in two countries. So if I had to, I can march right into your back door. And so I think that was something that wasn't easily seen by the general populace. And from a strategic standpoint, the last thing you want to do is enter into a two-front war. But if you're in a two-front war, but you're surrounding a threat nation and creating a two-front opportunity for yourself, it makes sense to do so. And I think that there was some strategery that was going on that behind closed doors, 10, 15, 20 years from now, somebody will write a book about, much more intelligent than myself. But I think that was part of it as well.
Well, I think you nailed it when you said, well, then there's the war on terror. Well, what the hell is that? You know what I mean? So we're talking about, does that mean that if we declare this a terrorist act in another country, that we no longer have to declare war on that country because we already have the war on terror? And what ends that? And that falls back to, what we were talking about earlier about having clear objectives. What is the clear exit to that? What genius came up with the withdrawal plan for Afghanistan after sitting on the ass over there for 20 flipping years? And that's where it all started there. Does that mean that, the war on terror, what does that mean to us domestically? And I think that's also given a lot of ambiguity to our role domestically as well, because now we've seen, the police forces in a militaristic way now.
Yeah.
And that was their catalyst. Well, it's the war on terror now. Now they got MRAPs at your local sheriff's department.
Yeah, and
that's another component.
Yeah.
So where does that end and where does that stop?
Yeah.
What is the goal?
Yeah, and I would
definitely
argue,
created tremendous ambiguity.
Yeah, and I would argue,
of course, it's hard to trust government with that kind of power.
Yeah, and I would argue in any of those situations, like if you can't handle it with a long gun, front and black plates and a helmet, then you're not fighting a war. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because again, like a material solution, you can have all the aviation you want, you can have all the boats, all the tanks, all the planes, and everything else. But guess what you cannot do with all of those assets? You cannot seize terrain. You have to put bodies against it. And I think that's something that a lot of people understand or understood. And we had a lot of political decisions made throughout the global war on terrorism that was based off of, hey, we can do this basically through telepresence, right? I can throw a drone over the top of something and, quote, occupy the land, but I can't, but I don't want to put people in there because that's politically untenable, right? And that goes across the board for all presidents over the last 20 years that GWAT was a thing, right? So it's like, hey, how do I effectively defeat the enemy, secure the homeland, and oh, by the way, back to your previous point, yeah, there's no reason for cops to have MRAPs. Like, why? Because MRAPs are downrange. Right? like seriously, when you really, really think about it, like what threat has gotten to the point, well, except for recently when, these autonomous zones started popping up. But again, that's politically based and we turned a blind eye to it because it was, on the other side or it was supporting something that I thought about. Hey, guess what? This crap will stop if, and not to get political, but if we had constitutional carry in this country, and we had a gun culture, like if everybody carried guns like we carried cell phones, guarantee there would not be a problem with it. Right? There wouldn't be a problem with it.
Hey, man, people learn infantry math real quick. Look, there's a 50% chance you ain't walking away now.
Right? Well, that's the thing in Texas.
Who the hell you are.
Right? Think about it. In Texas, that's the greatest part of Texas. Texas sells 3 million guns. They process 1.5 million concealed carry permits. So you have half the people that are carrying concealed and probably another 20 or 30% that are open carrying that probably have a concealed weapon as well. So now you've basically put yourself in the position where, like, I can play a game of F around and find out, and you're going to find out, and you're probably going to get dead before before the cops even get there. And so that's the mentality that has to change. I'm not saying like I get tired of hearing, we got to get rid of these semi-automatic weapons and this, that, and the other thing. Yes, I 100% agree that there are some law enforcement agencies that need more training. There is no doubt in my mind that is the case. Guess what? In most of these cities that are being overrun, that are crime-ridden, It's because they've taken away the training budget from the police. You say defund the police, guess what? You get guys that are now afraid to go out on patrol unless they have an MRAP and they're armed to the teeth, because they don't know if backup is coming. They don't know if they're going to be supported by their state and their state government, their local authorities and government. And so what you've done is you created an opportunity for this thing to spiral out of control because, one, we failed to do the basics of training. Like, hey, man, this is how you enter a building and clear a room. You know, you don't need to carry your firearm the whole time. You know what I mean? Like, you just don't need to. Like, you don't need to pull your gun if you're walking into a domestic situation, because you immediately escalate things. You know, hey, don't go into a domestic without a buddy if you can avoid it. Like, there's all kinds of different things that that you have to take into consideration. But again, if you look at the history of the military and you look at the operations that we talked about and discussed here briefly, you know, the biggest difference is, what was the political outcome? And that's a question that I can't answer for you. I can answer it for myself, what my thoughts are. You can answer it for yourself and what your thoughts are. But at the end of the day, you know, being able to understand the political outcome is just as important, because, again, the military is just another lever that you pull in your bag of tricks as a politician to get outcomes that you want. You know, and for so many years, particularly during the global war on terrorism, the military was it. Hey, we're sending you to do everything. Like, hey, we're sending you to go take care of Ebola. We're sending you to go take care of, you know, hell, we got soldiers on the border right now. Activated National Guard. Hey, we need to secure the border.
Hurricane relief.
You know what I mean? Hurricane relief. You got Katrina. You've got freaking all these other things that, one, the military is not designed to do. And this is kind of the point that I'll wrap with is, like, anytime I hear some civilian go, oh, well, we need to train our law enforcement like the 82nd. No, sir. No, sir. No.
Dude,
no.
Not a good idea.
Why? Because you're going to have a bunch of, you know, you're going to have a bunch of young people with firearms that could do some dangerous stuff if things go sideways, right? If you don't believe it, look at what happened in Tacoma when the Rangers pulled out all their firearms and got into a shootout with the Crips, right? You know, like,
they cased the wrong house, man. It's that simple.
Yeah, but like, that could easily happen in an escalation of force scenario if I have a bunch of police officers. Now, I'm not talking about the SUT guys, but I'm just talking about your regular, you know, police officer that is walking the beat. Like, if this dude is armed to the teeth and he knows how to 100% use his weapon and he's confident with using it to the point where it's like, hey, look, I know that I'm going to point at this person, center mass, put two in their chest and one in their face. And that's a wrap, right? You absolutely do not want, you know, I personally do not want my law enforcement agencies of any kind shooting control pairs. Like, just no, it's not good. And I think that it shows a large amount of naivete for people to just arbitrarily throw that out and say, oh, well, we need to train our military like the Rangers. No, you don't. Because those dudes will kill it and break a whole bunch of stuff. And, oh, by the way, you know, their default switch, you know, as a political person, if you're the political type of person that says, hey, police officers are too aggressive and they're always trying to kill, quote unquote, someone, you're literally giving them a blank check to do so when you say, hey, we want them trained like the Army or a particular unit in the Army, if that makes any sense. But, hey, we'll toss this whole short write-up in the podcast description. We'll give you some information on Mr. Novacell and some of the other things that we're talking about. Like, look, if you're a veteran and you served, cool. We appreciate your service. If you're a combat veteran, cool. We appreciate your service. But do us all a favor and don't make us all look like jerks by, you know, talking about how cool, you know, your time in service was if it wasn't. You know, I think we do more harm than good. It's just like anything else. It's like, yeah, people are going to swap stories and embellish things. But the reality of it is, you know, folks that have served in the dirt kind of can tell. You know, we know who we are because we can smell each other, you know, and that's not a bad thing. It's just kind of the way things are. But, yeah, without further ado, we're going to wrap this thing up. This has been Philosophy from the Frontline. I don't even remember what episode it is, but this is the start of year number 3 of this. And again, checking in with Dave, as always. It's always great to do.
Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, but we're going to continue to crank these out. Like, I took a pretty long hiatus because I was working with Ask for Football. So if you're not listening to the Ask for Football podcast, then you're not listening to Army football at all during the course of their season. And still working with the North Carolina Defense Technology Transition Office, and I'll put the description in the chat as well for the Def Tech podcast. Try and do that once a month or once a week, actually. And so there's a lot of content that I'm doing in other places that I'm going to point you guys to. Hopefully you enjoy it. And again, we appreciate everything that you guys do. Thanks for supporting the show, and we'll see you on the high ground. Thanks. Thanks for listening to Philosophy from the Frontline with Rob Robinson. We will bring you more interesting veteran transition stories, veteran advocacy, and more information in veterans transition in general on a podcast platform near you. This is Philosophy from the Frontline, and we'll see you on the high ground. Thanks.